the rich didn't die. So that was 1918. And then in the United States, you have something called the Great Depression, huge economic collapse, followed by an economic-related, the Dust Bowl, which was an environmental catastrophe partly. And those were the big hardships, recent hardships in the USA. And you can see the mortality there in both men and women in those periods. Then in the Second World War, you see that men have a mortality, whereas women do not. And I think we all understand why. And in the Vietnam War period, you can see that there's a hump in mortality for the men. This is what you can see in all-cause mortality. And so, in conclusion, I've been studying all-cause mortality extensively in more than 100 countries, on all the continents except Antarctica, obviously, and in great detail by unit time, by week, by day, by month, by age group, by sex, and I can tell you that the only thing you can see in all-cause mortality data are the following things. Seasonal variations, like I explained. A maximum in the winter, and in the southern hemisphere, it's reversed. Their winter is our summer, that's when they have a maximum of mortality. In the equatorial region, there is no seasonal variation in mortality. There's no spikes, it's a flat line. So there's seasonal variation that follows the hemispheres. You can see wars, like I mentioned. You can see economic collapses, huge economic collapses that affect populations. You can see summer heat waves in northern latitudes that are not used to having a very hot period in the summer. That kills people, sometimes because they fall down the stairs when it's really hot. But it kills people, and you can see a peak that lasts about a week in one of these hot spells. You can see earthquakes. Right away, you see the earthquake. People get crushed by buildings, you count the dead, and you see a peak due to earthquakes. But we do not see or detect any of the CDC claimed pandemics that occurred in 1957, 58, 68, 2009. Those pandemics, those so-called pandemics, do not give rise to any excess all-cause mortality that can be detected in any jurisdiction or by any means. Excess death cannot be detected on the national or state scale for these so-called pandemics. So they did not cause excess death, whatever they are. And then you have, I explained 1918, then we have the COVID period. And in the COVID period, there was a huge assault. There were a multi-pronged assault against people, vulnerable people in many different jurisdictions. So depending on what the state did before they brought in the vaccines, I'll talk about the vaccines as well, but depending on what the states did, they caused excess mortality, sometimes huge amounts of it, and I'll show you examples of that. So, first, I want to tell you that something just happened socially as part of the propaganda, which is that the Nobel Prize was awarded for this so-called vaccine. And I want to show you how absurd this is, because all the politicians that were supporting this were claiming that tens of millions of lives were saved by the vaccine, this magical vaccine for which we had given the Nobel Prize. Well, we looked at that. We looked at the basis for that claim. And the basis for the claim is an article that appeared in Lancet Infectious Diseases in 2022 by Watson et al. And they claim that between 14 and 19 million lives were saved. So we, as physicists, as scientists, we said, okay, if that's what you're claiming, let's calculate and see what that would look like on the scale of all-cause mortality by time. And so let's start somewhere, and let's go to Canada, and we see the seasonal cycle. So this is all-cause mortality on a scale that starts at 0. And let's look at the seasonal variation. That vertical line is the declaration of the pandemic. The very first peak you see in blue there is Canada killing elderly people and vulnerable people in hospitals and in care homes because of the aggressive initial treatments because they were concerned about this so-called pandemic. And this happened in many hotspots in Western countries, but it did not happen in any of the Eastern European countries or in Russia. So depending on the country, depending on what they did, that's the thing. It did not happen in Germany where they were not doing this. Okay. Then we go on and we bring in the vaccines, and they are claiming that this vaccine, which is the number of vaccines is that gray curve, that's the cumulative vaccine doses being given in Canada. And what you see is they're claiming that, thank God we brought in the vaccines at that time, because otherwise we would have had the mortality in red there. They're claiming that their vaccines saved us from having the mortality in red that they calculated. They're claiming that there would have been mortality like we've never seen in the history of a human society, and that thank God this vaccine came at just the time when there would have been this incredible mortality and saved us and brought down the mortality to basically the same level we've always had. That's what the vaccine did. Not halfway down, not somewhere in between, but just brought things down. This is the magic of the vaccine that is explained by the magic of mathematical models written by bought-out scientists working for bought-out politicians. So it is not true. The vaccine did not save lives. In fact, and I'll show Romania. I'll skip some slides. This is Canada again, but instead of showing raw all-cause mortality, we've corrected the mortality to show only the excess of mortality. And therefore, you have a flat baseline until the pandemic, and then you can see the excesses that occur at various times depending on what the government was doing, and again, the curve of predicted saved lives. Now we can do this. We can do this in the United States. The United States was a country that have many more vulnerable people health-wise than Canada, and treated them very aggressively. So the baseline, if you like, excess all-cause mortality in blue there has huge features which you do not see in Canada. And this is a very strange virus that we're dealing with here because it carries a passport. It refused to cross from the US into Canada, despite the fact that it's thousands of kilometers of the two biggest exchange partners, on the continent. The vaccine was not crossing borders. It didn't cross initially into Germany. When we draw maps of intensity of excess mortality, we see that the vaccine has definite passports depending on jurisdiction. In other words, this was not a spreading viral respiratory disease. Our conclusion from studying all the all-cause mortality, I'll tell you our conclusion before we get there, is that our data, this hard data, contradicts the idea that there was a particularly virulent pathogen that came onto the planet and that spread and that caused havoc by itself. Instead, what we see is that everywhere that there is excess mortality, you can understand it in terms of the incredible aggressive treatments that were done and the vaccines, which you can quantify. I gave you the conclusion ahead of time. I'm skipping ahead a bit, but no matter. This is what Europe looks like. Overall Europe, or the countries that we were able to include here, it looks quite similar to the US, the situation in the US. Now let me show you Romania. In Romania, there is no excess mortality at the beginning, right after the pandemic is announced. That just is a feature of hotspots in the Western European countries. But then there is a massive excess peak that starts. We're going to talk about that a little bit more because I'm starting to understand it as I talk to people who know more about Romania. And then the vaccines are rolled out, and I know that Romanians didn't get vaccinated maybe as much as others, but still, the claim in this theoretical paper is that the excess mortality would have been that red line if there had not been the vaccines. But what I see when I look at that pattern is that there's a peak right when you start rolling out the vaccines, then there's a really large peak when you roll them out again, and then you see that last peak there is directly associated to the booster doses that were given. So I'm going to look at that in some detail at the end of the talk when I talk about Romania. So coming back to all-cause mortality, not this theoretical red line stuff of what theorists are telling us, but coming back to the hard data, this is what it looks like in the United States. So on the bottom, you have all-cause mortality by month. You have the vertical line in each graph that shows the announcement of the pandemic. And mysteriously, at the announcement of the pandemic, there are hotspots synchronously at the same time in hotspots around the world where there's this huge initial peak of mortality. I was the first to write an article about that and to point out that normally viruses do not follow political directives, and they don't, so it has to be something else. And also there's no evidence that there was spread in this feature. It happens synchronously in the whole northern hemisphere, for example, and there's no evidence that it then spread. It was localized, it stayed there, and it was due mostly to extremely aggressive medical treatments, because the medical teams were told, they were propagandized that there was this horrible virulent thing that was just going to come down on us, and now we've just announced it's a pandemic. So they had a license to try whatever help they could give, and sometimes they prescribe too much, they intube people with mechanical respirators, a ghastly thing to do. And the places that did this most aggressively, these treatments, and we can follow that in our data, had the largest peaks of this type. Northern Italy, even Stockholm was, protecting the elderly especially, and they had a peak like that. And New York City obviously is well known. So this is mainly the New York City peak that you see in the US data here. Then the curve in the middle is all-cause mortality again, but by week now, a finer time resolution, so you can see more of the details. And the curve on top is a blow-up of that. And what you see for the first time in recorded history in the US, in the mortality history, is peaks occurring in mid-summer in the United States. Unheard of. And so I put black dots there to show them. The first one occurs at a time when they were really aggressing poor people who live in the very hot southern states, and the integrated mortality for that correlates with poverty. If you were poor, you died at that time. If you were not, you didn't die. And then they rolled out the vaccines, and the summer peak you get on rolling out the vaccine there is from what they called vaccine equity, which meant they hired thousands of people in the US to go and vaccinate everyone who hadn't been vaccinated yet, who was resisting or who was far away in a care home, and they aggressively went and vaccinated all those people. It was funded by Gates and all those people, and they produced that huge peak of mortality in the US there. So that's what the US mortality in recent times, COVID, looks like. If you look at now mortality in the US by age group, you can see the age groups there, 0 to 24 years, 25 to 44, and so on. Before they vaccinate, the percent increase, the excess mortality expressed as a percent of the baseline mortality for the age group looks like that on top. And in the vaccination period, the age structure of mortality changes dramatically and shifts towards younger individuals. That doesn't mean that quantitatively the elderly were not dying. Most of the deaths are in the elderly, as you would expect, but this is expressed as a percentage of the baseline. So in those terms, it shifts to younger people. And in the US, the total excess mortality in the COVID period as a whole correlates perfectly with poverty in the state for the 50 states in the United States. You will never see this in social science, such a strong correlation. It's very rare. And not only is it a strong correlation, we call it, it's technically called a very good correlation when it's that value of the correlation coefficient. And it goes through the origin, which means it's not just a correlation, it's a proportionality. The more poor you had in the state, the more people died in that state. Directly proportional. So this tells you that's another thing that viruses don't do. They don't select to only kill poor people. That doesn't happen. That's not a signature of a viral infection. So our model of what's been going on to cause mortality in the great majority of jurisdictions that we saw is the following model. We stress the literature. Well, first of all, there is what governments did. The socioeconomic impact, many people lost their jobs, lost their social contacts, lost their regular activities, lost their position in society. So incredible stress related to that. There was regulatory rules of all kinds. There was institutional pressures put on people. There were all kinds of conditions that you know about. And in some countries, it was much more violent than others. In Peru, they hired 10,000, they called in 10,000 military reservists right away to go and find all the people that could be found that would test positive for COVID, and they would extract them from their families, no matter how old they were, and isolate them. And there's a huge mortality peak in Peru as a result of that practice. So there was aggression. It caused psychological stress and social isolation. And scientifically, that is known to depress the immune system dramatically. This is very well established. It's a whole area of science to study this relationship with stress. And so therefore, you have that reduction in the immune system, and so you are more vulnerable to every kind of infection. And when you have, in a large population, depressed immunity, one of the organs that's most susceptible to immediately being infected is the lungs, because you already have an entire ecosystem of bacteria and everything in your own mouth and in your respiratory tract, and many of those can become quite dangerous to your lungs. So you get bacterial pneumonia. And my time's up, and I didn't even get to the vaccines or Romania. So I'll just show you the Romania data, okay? Again, this is years of work, more than 30 scientific reports about science related to COVID that you could find on my various websites, on our websites, and the one I gave. And so if we look at this is how we proved that the vaccines were actually causing the death, is that every time you rolled out a dose, you got immediately following an excess mortality. So this is the case of Israel. So doses 1 and 2, then the first booster, the second booster, and so on. And you can do it by age group like we're doing it here. You start with the most elderly, and you go down by age. And what you find is that by age, the toxicity of the vaccine, because we come to understand that the vaccine is a toxic substance that each person is going to react to differently, just like in toxicology, that if you give more doses, it's more dangerous because there's damage from the first doses. All the principles of toxicology are being followed here, in addition to the high age dependence. So what we found is that there is an exponential increase in the toxicity of the vaccine per dose, and the doubling time by age is 4 or 5 years of age. So your risk of dying per injection doubles every 4 or 5 years in age. And so in Israel, for example, if you're 80 plus years old, you're getting into almost a 1% death chance when you get infected. And it's higher in other countries. So we looked at Peru. You can see the massive peak there in Peru due to the military coming in. Here, this is the 90 plus age group. You can see the doses being rolled out. The one in color is the 4th dose, the peaks that are associated with it, and then we follow it as a function of age all the way down. We've got a lot of good data, and then we do a graph of what happened in Peru, and we can do the same thing for Chile, and we see that dose 4 in both of those countries gave that exponential rise, always the same doubling time, 4 or 5 years, and you're getting into one death per 20 injections here in the 90 plus year olds. So it was the elderly people that were mostly killed by the vaccines in terms of all-cause mortality. Of course, the young suffered death and all kinds of horrible side effects and so on. But in terms of mortality, the big groups that were dying, that were contributing to the excess mortality, is the elderly. And so that's the conclusions about vaccines. So we're able to, from this work, we're able to calculate how many people would have died globally, given that we've studied so many countries now. And we find that 17 million people were killed by the vaccines on the planet. That's our number. And I'm going to ignore that buzzer because I want to show you Romania. This is the data for Romania by age group. This is the correlation between the vaccine rollouts in dark blue and these huge peaks in excess mortality in Romania. There's no initial peak that, like you see in the Western countries. There's that one with the question mark that we have hypotheses about, and something very horrible happened in Romania to explain that. We have ideas about it. And then you have the vaccine deaths, and the last one is the booster. And so in Romania, we did a preliminary analysis of that booster, and it is killing. You get 1 death per 5 or 10 injections in the 80-plus-year-olds in Romania from the boosters. That's our conclusion, preliminary conclusion on the Romanian data, and that's my conclusion with the talk. And that's it. I can give it to you, or it was actually the last slide, which I forgot to show. But no, that may be complicated. I don't. Oh, is it on now? No, no, it's not possible, I think. Correlation-canada.org. This site, when you go to research, the research end, there's peer-reviewed papers in there, there's scientific reports, and there's some amazing work, theoretical work as well, that proves, for example, I'm going to tell you this because it's too important. You got to look through these papers. We have proven that if you accept theoretical epidemiology as it was used by governments, you can show that if you want to protect elderly people, the worst thing you can do is isolate them in care homes and in their homes. It is absolutely the thing that will maximize infections and death. And we showed that. It's now a peer-reviewed accepted paper, and we showed that that was true in general for the elderly. So the governments have been saying we have to protect the elderly by isolating them and preventing them from being infected. And we proved using standard epidemiological models with all the possible parameters that the opposite is true. So the government has been truly lying on that. They should know better. These models have existed for a decade. So that's just another example of the work we do. There are many different things that we've done during COVID, if you want to study that website.
How's everybody doing? Long day, but we'll carry on. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Well, it's wonderful to be here. We thank the folks who invited us, the wonderful people of Romania, the wonderful Parliament of Romania. We're all honored to be here. And we thank the minority parties, the majority parties, all the people of Romania have given such an example to all of us, because in the people's choice to take such a modest uptake of the vaccine at 30% plus or minus, that was not something that was specifically dictated by the government. The government wasn't saying, let's come out in fewer numbers to take this vaccine. But the people, in their own hearts and mind, the people of Romania have seen many struggles these last 60 years. And they know that sometimes it's not really wise to listen to everything your government is telling you. And I applaud that internal awareness, and that Romania, as a result, is able to show lower mortality rates than many other countries because of the lowered uptake of the vaccine. So for that, we specifically thank you. Now, I also wish to thank our hosts, the people who welcomed us here. Lily and Robert, I know personally, and I know you have a team of people around you. So I want to thank the ICS for their wonderful creation of this event here in Romania. But we will now go forward, if I may, and I'm Dr. Chris Shoemaker. Thank you, everyone. I wanted to thank you for staying to the final 3 talks of today. I'm glad to be here. It's very personal to me. As an ER physician, I've always known that the rapidity of my action and accuracy of my thought can make a difference between life and death for the person in front of me, or for their child, or for their loved one. It's important to be right in those moments. Here today, I intend to be equally accurate as I speak to all Romanians, and indeed all Europeans, about the beacon of safety that Romania has shown to you. But we also have to tell you, we've been lied to. We've been given absolutely false data by Pfizer, Moderna, the WHO, and every country and every health agency that has listened to them. With thanks to the wonderful doctors and scientists who preceded me at the stage here today, you already know the deep lies by the deep state and the lying elites and their global paid-off media that wanted just one story to be real. You know now that no DNA is in the jabs. Oops, that's a complete lie. That's what mainstream told us in year 1 and 2. No DNA in there, can't possibly affect your genome. Well, we know from the talks today that that was false. You know that the vaccines just stay in the shoulder. Dr. Byron Bridle was the first to show us that is a complete lie. And we know that myocarditis, we were told, oh, it's just 1 in a million as it was before the jab. Another complete lie. Why? Because we know from research out of Basel, Switzerland, that 5 to 9% of the people in that study experienced significant cardiac harm. 5 to 9%, that's 50,000 to 90,000 situations of heart damage for every million citizens that get the jab. That's pretty nasty truth. And as a doctor, I know that if you actually get myocarditis, if you have diagnosable myocarditis, I've known this for 45 years and it's still true, 75% of you will be dead in 10 years. I'm very sorry to tell that to families and to people who have a child or themselves with myocarditis. It's either that or a transplant. You might succeed if you get a transplant. So those are your choices. If you've got vaccine-induced myocarditis with evident harm, 50% are dead in 5 years, 75% are dead in 10 years. That's the problem with truth. It's sad. And that's the problem when we've been lied to and allowed truths like this to occur in our bodies and in the bodies of our dearly departed loved ones. Other truths are that we know that massive numbers of menstrual abnormalities and infertility are spreading through the vaxxed. Dr. Jim Thorpe has told us that, and I believe the gynecologists and obstetricians that spoke earlier this afternoon alluded to that. 2 cancer specialists, Dr. Dalgleish and, of course, Dr. Cole as well, have let us know that aggressive turbo-speed cancers are spreading through the vaccinated population. And Jessica Rose has told us the reason for that. So it's all coming together, isn't it? It's been one big, horrific lie allowed to exist because the lie was so well controlled. The lie was so well told by multiple agencies who were obviously in touch with each other, very obviously in touch with each other. So today I'd like you to think for a moment that you're not in the Parliament. You're in the emergency room for your nation. The health and fertility of your nation is the patient. When the patient is in front of you, you have to act. You have to make the quick and accurate decision to save your loved ones from the lie. So to help you from the lie, I'll show you some truth instead. The truth is that C-19 harm vaccines are life-shortening, they're toxifying, they basically act like a fountain of aging. That's what we're seeing around us. Could I have further pictures of the next picture on this lovely picture? I think there were 2 pictures of my dear friend Colleen. There she is in both pictures. That was before her vax. 2 years later, if we can see pictures 3 and 4, 2 years later, she looks like this. I believe there's one more picture. A woman whose vaccinated husband now has only 3 months to live due to his having post-CARB C19 vax injury and cancer. A woman whose 23-year-old, previously healthy son has already suffered a massive pulmonary vessel embolus. He too is post-vax. She is Colleen, a beautiful Canadian registered nurse and mother. These are the results in her body and to her face of 2 Pfizer harm vaxes. If we could now just see video A, please. This was something that she personally posted just to let friends and family know how she was doing and not doing due to all of this. And in a minute and 11 seconds, she was able to show the transition that occurred in her over those 24 months. Will we likely have it, or will we have to likely move on from video A? Okay, I guess we're getting close. That's looking like part of it. Thank you. Can it start from the beginning? That's the very end. I don't know if it can start from the beginning, but this is the end. This is now, what's going on now in her body. You remember those lovely pictures with her pure and normal skin. Everything's right and Jim Dandy, thank you very much. And within 18 months, these skin lesions, vasculitis, other neurologic conditions as well, severe brain fog, memory fatigue, things like that have all occurred to her. But the physical pictures in the full video were quite dramatic. I weep for her. I weep for every deeply harmed innocent human who was lied to and mentally coerced in taking this toxin into her body. Oh, here indeed is the full length of the video. Thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate it. Those are good days right there for Colleen. Everything's fine. And then boom, this is where she's at 18 months to 2 years later. It's pretty nasty diastolic. Those was an insertion of another time, but 105 without treatment for a diastolic blood pressure. Thank you so much, Robert. We're going to now quickly go to another area of childhood harm by the vaxes. And this is a 1-minute video. If Robert can bring up video B, the tragedy of shots in pregnancy.
Biggest number of all. They had a portion of their population study, and this chart shows a graph.
That's all we got.
They didn't tell us what happened to the other 238.
Okay, well, I'll speak over it.
Pfizer's
own data. There were 230 patients they wouldn't tell us about. There were 30 that they couldn't not tell us about. 28 out of the 29 mothers-to-be were not mothers-to-be. 28 out of 29 dead babies, either early or late in term.
And the other 5 lost the baby. It was a stillbirth. It was a death in utero. 1 living child out of 29.
1 out of 29 survived. This is the data that Naomi Wolf found out when she went through those 75,000 pages. She found awful, awful, awful data. This is before it was released to the wider population. This was in the people who had volunteered to, test it on me. I'm pregnant, but you say you're going to give it to pregnant women. Please go ahead. I'll be part of the study. The deaths in that group were horrendous, and they were the canary in the mine shaft that should have protected the whole world from taking it. As Dr. Thorpe told us, the fact that they made it look okay for pregnant females and their children, and they lied to say that it was okay, that's what got the rest of the world on board. Oh, well, we can't be worried now because, my goodness, pregnant women are approved for it by our FDA and others. But the numbers were not there proving safety. The numbers were there proving harm. Again, awful. And how could this happen? How could this evil happen? Would persons have done this on purpose? It would seem that nothing this horrible happens by accident. I certainly agree with Dr. David Martin. There is nothing about this that is accidental. There are numerous files and patents that prove that it was on purpose. And I'll stand here right now and I specifically accuse Dr. Anthony Fauci and his cooperation with Dr. Ralph Barrick out of North Carolina and their further cooperation out to Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance. They can sit in a hearing and tell us who their masters were if they want. But that's what has to happen. Those three people have to tell us who were their masters that made this deleterious thing happen to all of us. Africa, South America, here in Europe, Canada, England, Australia, China. Because it didn't all start in China. All of the patents to do this genomic creation, the genomes that went into the aerosolized quasi-virus, and that went into the vaxes. They're the identical genomes, and the hallmarks and the fingertips over the making of this were Dr. Fauci's and Dr. Barrick's. If we could now go on to a couple of short videos that address the early onset and the early lies. They are videos 4 and 5 together, if we could kindly have them, Robert. Well, we had tested the sound. I'm very deeply sorry that we're not hearing it properly.
The original SARS-CoV-1 occurred, and all sorts of experiments went on to determine what would be a useful...
Okay, well, that was me sitting in a living room in February of 2022, and I'm saying essentially,
and
DARPA
the American research arm of the U.S.
had told Dr. Fauci, we won't study this for you, we won't do it for you. You've been told by your president not to do it. And by the way, we've done a bunch of investigations that tell us that no vaccine can ever work. No vaccine can ever work against a coronavirus. It will always be inefficient. There will always be variants driven by the fact that you're vaccinated. Please don't do it, Dr. Fauci. That's a ridiculous idea. We won't help you with it. But somehow it went forward anyway. They did an end around. They took the research to China, and the circumstances evolved to the point that ivermectin was not spoken of positively. DARPA knew that too. DARPA knew that ivermectin worked beautifully. If there was a pandemic, ivermectin would work. Hydroxychloroquine would be extremely helpful as well. That was in all the scientific papers. People knew that around the world, that these were the two things. After COVID-1, SARS-CoV-1, they researched for 13 years to figure out what would be used. And you know, everybody was kind of relaxed because the senior scientists all around the world knew that DARPA had tested this out and that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine were gold standard medications that would actually help us if there was ever a COVID event. So the COVID event happens, and none of those senior scientists tell us, or DARPA shuts up, or people are told to shut up, and then they put false studies out that imply that ivermectin is a negative thing. If the next video plays, I'll comment about it nonetheless. If it can be run, I guess it would be video 5, and I'll comment over that. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your comfort about it. I appreciate it. Okay, we could just not attempt to get that next video. Just kindly go to the blank screen. That'll be fine, and I'll just speak about it. And I'll just speak what I said in that video, the one that we're not going to show now. It was a rhetorical question. And I said that if a certain gentleman named Fauci had taken offshore genomic information, made sure that EcoHealth Alliance worked on it in China, and he equally made sure that once the genome, and he got the email that says in December 2015, they said, Daszak wrote him and said, we've got it. And what we've got it meant in December of 2015, we've got the genomic elements that can be attached to a coronavirus, and we can investigate it further. And then two things happened after that. From early 2016 onwards, the actual research to create the aerosolized, contaminating, dangerous coronavirus did happen for 4 years in China. Meanwhile, in the same 4 years, research was going on to have the vaccine available for it. So that's 4 years of mutual decision-making on both sides of the Pacific, of which Dr. Fauci and Dr. Barrick and Dr. Peter Daszak, who I believe has just testified this week, although I don't know what he said, but those three people knew what was going on, and they were the ones making it happen. Did people above them help to make them happen? Absolutely. I'm not in a position to know who they are. But perhaps further senior scientists and investigators will let us know. Thank you very much for listening to that and our concern of what's happened to us. So, I don't know if, Robert, if you feel that there's one video that might play well, if for anything technically you feel it might, you're welcome to play it, and then I'll make a comment after. Indeed. Fair enough. That's too bad. Okay. There might be one more that I'll seek to have you up even without the audio, but give me a moment to keep myself together, and I'll ask you for that in a second. Yeah, okay. I'll take anything with sound. Oh, wait a minute, it's without sound, okay. I will take, if I could, I think we called it Video 3, or the one with Video 3, it was, if that's accessible to at least run. Okay. And you can keep the sound low, it's okay, I'll just talk over top of it. There's a gentleman from Brothers News. It was late August of 2022. For 10 straight days, I stood in front of City Hall, trying to inform all of Canada and all the world that Denmark had already canceled the vax for children. Denmark, in September of 2022, stopped allowing parents to bring their children in for vaccinations against COVID, with one very rare exception, specific immune-damaged circumstance. The child's already got cancer or something like that. If the parents wanted it, they wouldn't refuse. But they said that for the general population, it was way too damaging for the child than to take it. Or it was way too damaging to take it than to not take it where they'll be well. So children, and that's why I'm holding the Denmark flag. That's not the Canadian flag there. I was holding the flag of Denmark and letting them know, hey, world, Denmark can read scientific studies. They're worried about the risk effects of these jabs, and 18 and under couldn't get it after the 1st of September last year. 2 months later, Denmark canceled it for everyone 50 and under. Stephanie Seneff, many other excellent scientists. Some of the scientists are sitting in this room, but I'll simply mention her. She showed the risks, the risk to benefit ratio, and there was no benefit for anyone under the age of 50 to take these jabs. All it was doing was heightening, as Dr. Rancourt told us, all the all-cause mortality was shooting up in the 49-year-olds, the 38-year-olds, the 27-year-olds, and the 17-year-olds. Their all-cause mortality is soaring, was soaring, and will continue to soar because of what's in these jabs. We know all sorts of things that are terrible, and probably in this next year we'll learn one or two more things that we don't even know about now. But we sure know the profile. We sure know what it's done to us. We sure know what it's done to 6-month-olds suckling at the breast of their mother who had a shot and turning blue from the stuff, the spike-laden stuff that's coming out of the breast milk, and the baby's dead at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. This is real. We all know it's real. And that's what I was speaking of there. And one other thing I spoke of was a specific number. Back a year ago, people didn't know this number. I had just learned about it. That's why I got in front of the camera and talked about it. And I said, do you know how many spikes are actually, or how many spike-generating factories go in with every shot? Because it's not spike itself, it's the mRNA which allows the spike to be factorized. And it's not 80 like a polio shot. No, not 80, not 100, not 1,000. It's 40,000 billion. 40,000 billion mRNAs go into every shot. And we've learned since, thanks to the scientists who just reminded us here this afternoon, it's actually 13 trillion by weight DNA product and 26 trillion by weight of mRNA. Because if you've done the analysis, and Dr. McKernan did it, and you find that 1/3 by weight is DNA. Sure, they're small bits, they're fragments, they're in plasmids. It's not a continuous DNA loop, of course. But by weight, 2/3 is the protein-generating mRNA, and the other 1/3 are bits and pieces of DNA that help to make it. And I would say it was left in there by purpose. That was no accident. You don't leave that much detritus in the liquid that's going to end up in little vials and go into people's arms. You don't leave that in there by accident, not by that percentage. 33%. So, and by the way, that's a reminder that I have 5 minutes left. I had them set it differently, so it was, thank you, you could turn it off. I've spoken for 15 minutes, and I'll try to wind up over the next 3 or 4. In fact, I will. The last thing I've learned lately, and this we can't say with the certainty that we can now say about DNA. 6, 7 months ago, we couldn't state with certainty that there was DNA in the jabs. But now we can state it with certainty. I don't know if 6 months now we'll have absolute certainty that Karen Kingston is correct in her analysis of scientific weights and items and hydrogel and things like that, the kind of things that can allow certain clot-like things to perpetuate in your arteries. But she certainly has concerns, as do other scientists, that there can be some direction applied to what's in us already, that there's at least the potential, I'm not saying it's true, but certain scientists are saying it, that there's potential that 5G can make what's inside us even worse. 5G waveforms, if done on a very high scale. And were that to happen, well then what's in us will get worse. I can't speak to what would be the way. I'll leave that for other scientists 5 or 6 months from now to tell us. But one thing I would say to Romania, what do we do to stay well? What do we say to the rest of Europe to stay well? Because this is real, everybody. People in Berlin who are watching this, and in Scotland, and in Portugal, and in Buenos Aires, this is entirely real what all the doctors and scientists have said to you these last few days. I'd tear down every 5G tower in every nation. They're too dangerous in what they can do to us on a lot of levels, not just on perhaps causing something to explode in us from an mRNA injection, but the things that they already do to our brain waves and tumor production and things like that. 5G is convenient, but I don't think for a moment that it's our friend in terms of health. The second thing I would do is to ban lipid nanoparticle and plasmid injections of all types. Dr. Malone knows why mRNA didn't go forward in a major way. I mean, there were, and I don't know, I can't quote this. I won't quote Dr. Malone. I respect him so much. I'm just saying that under your watch, mRNA did not get used for anything other than cancer research, for people who had 5 months or less to live. That was the only potential use that I believe that the scientists that Dr. Malone was working with years and years ago, they were allowing it to be used for that because there was a shown risk. There was a risk in animal studies where lipid nanoparticle all by itself could be harmful, virtually lethal. So, and finally, I would say that medications going forward are one of our major helps to the fact that we've got this deleterious stuff inside us. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, doxycycline, quercetin, fenbendazole. They're ideas, and they're going to get more proof as to what's best about them. And there are other waveform-based therapies that also have a benefit. And high-dose vitamin C has a benefit. But I'm not going to state categorically, heck, I'm a doctor who's not allowed to prescribe anymore because my license has been taken away because I dared to tell society that there was risk to these things. So all I can tell you is that I believe that 99% of what I've told you is the truth, and the 1% that might not be, it's an honest mistake, because I'm just trying to tell the full story. And I hope we're all well, and I hope we don't count on carriers that can hurt us, especially with DNA inside those carriers. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This is all for today. See you in the morning. Do not forget about to leave at the entrance, yes? And tomorrow, come with your badges. Thank you. Have a good night.